Hi, I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USA Watchdog. Today we have back on financial regulator, PhD in economics, also a professor of law, also has a PhD specializing in white-collar crime. And wow, signs of the time and a great time to have on William Black from University of Missouri, Kansas City. Professor Black, thanks for joining us today on USA Watchdog.
Thank you.
Well, the motivation for having you on, I had you on almost about a month ago or so, and you're so enlightening on the regulation part of it and the bankers, and I just can't let this go. And again, I'm reading the newspaper, and the way the USA Today last week showed this. This is Ken Lewis, the former CEO of Bank of America, and he's paying a $10 million fine to settle civil fraud charges for the Merrill Lynch Bank of America merger. And the way the USA Today, promotes it, it looks like, well, Ken Lewis got a parking ticket. I mean, this is a major CEO of a big bank, one of the biggest banks in America, and here this guy said, yeah, I'll pay a $10 million fine to settle fraud charges. No criminal charges. Why should people care about this, and why does the USA Today report this so trivially? If that's a word.
Well, it was treated as a trivial matter by the federal government. So this action had to be brought by the state of New York. And Ken Lewis is no longer CEO. So the
former CEO, yes,
that they got is primarily that he will not be a CEO, but he has no intention of being a CEO. And he's not paying $10 million. Bank of America is paying the $10 million, so he could care less. And he didn't have to admit anything. And unlike the typical Securities and Exchange Commission settlement, he didn't have to agree not to disparage the settlement. So as immediately he disparaged the settlement as a bunch of junk that wasn't true. On top of those things, the Securities and Exchange Commission already failed to bring an action against this. And the reason that came out, so the good news about Schneiderman and before him Cuomo as Attorney General of New York. Now Cuomo's governor, but this action began in New York under Cuomo. Schneiderman, the current Attorney General, continued it. The good news about all of this is if they even investigate a little bit, facts come out. Not much, but in this case the fact came out that Lewis testified. The subject of this complaint, which was allegedly securities fraud in hiding the losses at Merrill Lynch, which was acquired by Bank of America, said, hey, it's not me, it's Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson, then Treasury Secretary under the Bush administration, who ordered me to cover this up, right? Now, the other thing is, as soon as this settlement came out, as I said, he issued a press blast, and Bank of America issued a press blast disparaging it, saying, hey, Ken Lewis couldn't have done anything wrong. There was outside legal counsel involved. Well, of course, under that standard, no CEO can ever commit securities fraud because they all hire top law firms, and they rely on them, right? And such. Now, so who has sued them? Well, Federal Housing Finance Administration actually sued them, them being Bank of America, and got billions of dollars in settlement for fraud, massive fraud by Bank of America in sales to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And that settlement was announced recently, and guess who was hired so that he could be in this whole thing at Fannie in this prominent position? Well, that would be the general counsel of Bank of America under Ken Lewis, the guy he purports in part to have relied upon and such. So, the web is very tight, and it's very protective of all these people. And they will trade off any amount of money in settlement that will be paid by the bank to ensure that the officers, even the ex-officers, never have to pay and never are prosecuted. And so even today, we are now, well into 2014, the Department of Justice record is intact, 0 prosecutions of the elite officers who's led the epidemics of fraud, the most destructive in world history, that caused the financial crisis, 0 of them even unsuccessfully prosecuted, much less prosecuted.
Well, and then we have the 5 former employees guilty in the Madoff Ponzi scheme that they came out last week. Okay, but the prosecutor said that Bernie Madoff couldn't have done this by himself, something to that effect. He couldn't have done this alone, or one person couldn't do this. And I agree, one person couldn't do it, but it took a lot more than just the 5 people that got convicted last week in Madoff. I mean, their shareholder lawsuits with J.P. Morgan now alleging that the J.P. Morgan CEO, Jamie Dimon, knew about it, along with about a dozen of his top senior banking officials, and they're suing them, saying for the reason, hey, the bank's paying out with $2.5 billion to settle, fraud charges, criminal charges. They get to pay a fine, and they're being sued for that. What does that tell you about our culture?
Well, it tells you, first, exactly what you said. The Justice Department is correct. Madoff couldn't do it alone. And you are correct in your inference that he couldn't do it without the help of massive financial institutions. So what do we know about this, and why could they not permit this kind of thing to come to trial? Well, we know that a senior executive at J.P. Morgan told another in a lunchroom that there was a serious cloud hanging over Madoff's head because he was suspected of running a Ponzi scheme. Now, that's in mid-2007. In fact, it's before mid-2007, right? Now, the predecessor huge bank, which we think is Bankers Trust, stopped eventually doing business with Madoff because it believed that he was engaged in running a Ponzi scheme, and it filed a suspicious activity report, which is jargon for a criminal referral, but only with the British authorities, not with the United States, even though, of course, Madoff was operating principally in the United States. But it gets worse. So the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency examiners become suspicious that J.P. Morgan is involved in a Ponzi scheme as well. And they get stonewalled. They get stonewalled by J.P. Morgan, which says, we've done an internal investigation. And we had lawyers involved, so it's attorney-client privilege, and you can't look at the files. Now, attorney-client privilege doesn't operate against the government as an examiner for banks. I was the litigation director of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board. We did this all the time, right? The provision is that you don't waive your privilege because it's compulsory to allow us to see this. Now, this doesn't go when they're suing us, right? Then they have an attorney-client privilege. But when it's against some other party, then we get to see those documents immediately. And if we had gotten stonewalled, we would have been A, we would have sent the examiners into the institution the next day, and B, I would have sued them the next day to get these materials. Somehow, instead, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which was supposed to be examining these institutions, and again, the examiners correctly are suspicious, they bucket to the Inspector General, eventually, of the Treasury. And the Inspector General of Treasury goes to the Department of Justice and says, enforce subpoenas. Get us these documents so we can find out whether there's a Ponzi scheme. And the Department of Justice refuses.
And this was long before the Bernie Madoff, the whole thing blew up.
That's right. So, and like most Ponzi schemes, of course, it has to grow or die. So the last couple of years of growth are huge compared even to the overall scheme. So you could have still saved enormous number of people from being victims of this had you acted. Now, the government got a settlement from J.P. Morgan alleging that they aided and abetted the frauds. And by the way, the Supreme Court, in an act of insanity over 10 years ago, or roughly 10 years ago, declared that you and I, if we're defrauded, we can't sue those that aid and abet the frauds. Only the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Justice Department can bring those actions. So if they don't bring those actions, we're out of luck as victims of all of these things. And they not only didn't bring those actions, they blocked those actions by the government by refusing to enforce the subpoena.
So J.P. Morgan saying that they didn't know anything about it, no, that doesn't wash. They admitted they knew about it.
Yes, there was an internal investigation. There were senior people who admitted that they believed that it was a Ponzi scheme. And there were things like there was, in addition to Bankers Trust, which has also come to the conclusion that it was a Ponzi scheme, there was this other weird guy who's deceased who was running a massive check kiting operation in the billions of dollars to help Madoff. So he was acting like a private bank, and he had offices. The J.P. Morgan actually gave him an office at J.P. Morgan to assist in his operations inside. So this is dirty as all hell. If it had come to a trial, instead of J.P. Morgan settling on this, it could have blown them completely out of the water. And of course, there's also the executor, for the estate of the Madoff fund, who has also said that J.P. Morgan was engaged in aiding and abetting this fraud. So
isn't this RICO? I'm going to stop. Isn't this racketeering, organized crime? This is crime. This isn't civil litigation or civil fraud. This is organized crime that should be prosecuted under the RICO Act. Where is the FBI? Where is the Justice Department?
Okay, so as a former Justice Department lawyer in the Civil Division, what people need to understand is that the elements of fraud are the same for civil and for criminal cases. In other words, if you can, in good faith, as the Department of Justice, allege that they have engaged in fraud in your civil action, then you are charging that they committed a crime, right? Effectively. Because those same actions would constitute a crime. The only thing that's different is your burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, that's a big difference if you're a prosecutor, but the elements of the fraud are the same. I have to prove the same things. So in all of these civil fraud cases, which are now in the scores that the Justice Department and the Federal Housing Finance Administration and the various federal home loan banks have brought, all of those actions could have been brought as criminal prosecutions. And of course, the Federal Housing Finance Administration doesn't have the power to bring it as a criminal case. Only the Justice Department can bring criminal cases, and they have absolutely refused. And Holder, and before him, Lanny Brewer as head of the criminal division, Eric Holder as Attorney General of the United States of America, have both refused to bring a single criminal case against the elite bankers who caused these frauds. They brought hundreds of cases against Jim and Mary, some little trivial minnows and pan fry. But against the elite bankers who actually caused the crisis, none.
That's just simply outrageous. Isn't the FBI abdicating their responsibilities? I mean, doesn't the FBI take an oath to protect against all enemies, both foreign and domestic? Aren't these domestic enemies of the country if they're crashing our financial system?
Well, the FBI isn't the prime villain in all of this. It's the Department of Justice, right? So the FBI, to its credit, in September 2004, its guy in charge of dealing with mortgage fraud, not somebody out in the lark, his name was Chris Swecker, went public multiple times in 2004. That's a long time ago.
The Bush administration, they did the same thing.
And testified that there was an epidemic, that was his word, of mortgage fraud, and predicted that it would cause a financial crisis. Crisis was his word, unless the government stopped the epidemic of fraud. What happened? Well, there's a recent Inspector General's report that came out 2 weeks ago by the Inspector General of the Department of Justice that says that the Department of Justice has been lying to us, that instead of being a high priority, mortgage fraud is a virtually non-existent priority. it's below 10. And within even the civil world, it's a low, low, low priority. That the numbers that they claim they brought of mortgage fraud actions were inflated by over 4 times, that the losses supposedly involved were inflated by something like 10 times, and that the number of FBI agents, which remains trivial compared to the crisis assigned to this, is overstated because many of those people aren't actually working mortgage fraud cases. They're actually detailed to do national security, et cetera, et cetera. But the bigger news the Inspector General refused to discuss, because the bigger news is they're simply not investigating any of the big guys. They're only looking not just at minnows, but as I say, pan fry. You got small cases. As recently as about 2 years ago, they were bragging that half of their cases now were $1 million. Well, that's 2 California homes for mortgage fraud. So that gives you
medium-priced homes.
Yeah, medium-priced homes for California purposes. So what they don't discuss at all, what you can find on the web, is with no criminal referrals from the banking regulatory agencies, and only we, the banking regulators, to use, if I can put on that hat, my former hat, we're the only ones who are going to do any significant number of criminal referrals against the CEO. Banks won't make criminal referrals against their own senior officers for obvious reasons. Well, those used to be measured. We did over 30,000 in the savings and loan crisis. There are 0 now from that same agency. And the Inspector General report doesn't even discuss the concept of banking regulatory agencies making criminal referrals. All of its references to criminal referrals are by the banks, which of course say, don't look at us, look at Fred and Mary and such. So with no expertise from the regulators, where's the FBI going to get expertise about banking? Again, your viewers can find it on the web or read my stuff. In 2007, the FBI formed, and it maintains to this day, what it calls a partnership with the Mortgage Bankers Association. Well, the MBA is the trade association of the perps. And the greatest con ever, the MBA foisted on the FBI, and even the Inspector General reports just repeats this con with no thought, and that is, the Mortgage Bankers Association says that all fraud is divided into 2 parts, fraud for housing, fraud for profit, and guess what? They're the victims always of all kinds of fraud. So the actual major frauds run by the CEOs, the dominant cause of the crisis, can't exist. It's as if you went to a zoologist and asked him to look for unicorns. He'd look at you like you were crazy. He knows that unicorns don't exist. Well, the FBI now knows that accounting control fraud doesn't exist and can't exist because the Mortgage Bankers Association told them. So that is the massive scandal. And let me end with, think back to the civil suits. So the FDIC has brought a civil suit because, again, it can't bring a criminal action. And the civil suit is against 16 of the largest banks in the world, the 3 largest banks in America, the 3 largest banks in the United Kingdom, the largest bank in Germany, and the largest bank in Japan, and several of the largest banks in Switzerland. Really big banks, right? And the point is, this is the largest cartel in world history by at least 3 and probably 4 orders of magnitude. This is LIBOR, the London Interbank Offered Rate. This is price fixing of this rate that is then used to set the price of over $300 trillion in financial product. A trillion is 1,000 billion. This is massively bigger than the real economy, right? So to fix this rate, effectively all 16 of these banks had to not only agree to form a cartel and cheat the rest of the world, but to do so for years, because if even a single one of them had defected and made it public, the whole thing falls apart. And they're the only 16 banks involved in setting LIBOR. So it's not like the other big banks, refused to cheat. They just weren't in a position to engage in this particular form of cheating. And guess what? Our old friend JP Morgan is back as one of the entities that engaged in this fraud. As I wrote, look, there are only two possibilities. Either the Obama administration knew all about this, or it knew nothing about it until it read this FDIC lawsuit. Okay, in the first, if you know that 16 of the largest banks in the world are engaged in massive fraud, wouldn't that suggest a problem where you have a national and indeed global crisis, right? I went through the list of how big these banks are in all of the major industrial countries of the world, or at least the free world, right? Excluding China for these purposes. Or you just learned about it, in which case you should be going, oh my God, our system has completely rotten. All of the largest banks who were involved eagerly engaged in this fraud for years, covered it up and such. We need to take action. Guess what? Did you see the Attorney General hold their press conference about this lawsuit? Did you see the FDIC?
No. Obviously, they're not doing anything about it.
No, it never happened, right? I went to the FDIC website that day.
Ignored it.
There's no mention of the lawsuit. We apparently think it's just sort of normal that these entities would engage in these fraud. Like I said, Fannie Mae hires the general counsel of Bank of America that it says at Bank of America led the frauds. And it hires somebody else as well who Bank of America had actively, specifically named her as leading a fraud, and then it hired her. It's no barrier to working for working for top financial institutions in the senior ranks that one says that they're engaged in fraud.
Is the entire system rotten?
Yes, but no reaction. No reaction from the New York Times played it as, well, maybe it's a tough case to bring about it. There was no ethical question in DealBook. DealBook is their entities, Andrew Ross Sorkin, that's sort of branded within New York Times that deals with financial matters, right?
Yeah, he's the guy who's taking care of ethics and has none. I mean, in my opinion. Right,
but they don't even have a pretense that someone might be worried about the ethics if 16 of the largest banks, all 16 relevant banks, but again, all decided to cheat, according to the United States government. And this is after years of investigation by a host of folks, all of whom find that they indeed cheated and that it came from the top. This is the type of conspiracy that can't come from the little people. It's got to come from the top.
So let's fast forward into why people should care about this. What this means is, you just said that the entire system is rotten globally. Is that right?
Yeah, at the largest financial institutions are rotten to the core because there's been this race to the bottom. In fact, there have been multiple races to the bottom. One race to the bottom is the ethics of the officers of the senior banks, but the other race to the bottom is in regulation. And the City of London won that race, but of course many other people ran with it, so that they all ended up, including the United States, very near the bottom. But that's why the City of London is the ultimate cesspool at this time for the financial system, and you see so many scandals coming out. By the way, last week they just announced a new one about their insurance companies are also basically shafting all of their older customers, they fear.
And if they prosecute, what they're doing is they're afraid they're going to implode the system. I'm not making excuses for them, but it's so rotten. If the minute they pull a pickup stick out of the stack, it all falls. Is that right?
Well, Holder said that expressly. Indeed, Holder testified in front of Congress and said that that's what's happened, that they are now too big to prosecute. He tried to walk it back almost immediately because he realized, you're at the Justice Department, you're running it, that we have a statue there, and a Lady Justice has blindfold. And that's supposed to symbolize that she doesn't look at whether you're rich and powerful. There's justice for all. But of course now he's got over, he pulls it up and says, oh, big banker, different rules for you. And Lanny Brewer was even worse when he was head of the criminal division. He used to go on, and he even told this to the Frontline documentary, that he loses sleep at night for fear that he might do something that could lead to a major fraudulent bank failing.
Well, therein lies the problem. Just because they don't prosecute this massive fraud, isn't it ultimately going to bring down the global system?
If they persist, it will bring it down again. It already did bring down the global system. Let us recall that in 2008, the financial system of the Western world collapsed. And the absolute only thing that brought it back was massive infusions of cash, some from TARP, but far more from the Federal Reserve here in the United States, and then to a lesser extent, central banks elsewhere in Europe. But for example, the Central Bank of Switzerland didn't have enough dollars to save the Swiss banks. And so in essence, the Federal Reserve of the United States made an unsecured loan to the Central Bank of Switzerland to bail out the two major Swiss banks, one of whom, by the way, was involved in this LIBOR scandal, and the other of whom we secretly bailed out through AIG. That was Tim Geithner's call.
And so let's fast forward to today. So a lot of people think that the economy is getting better, that the financial system is fixed, that we are in a recovery. I have friends of mine that say, oh, it's not that bad, is it? It's better than it was, right? And what would you say?
I would say that modern financial regulators are vastly more sophisticated than we were back as savings and loan regulators, because we had never figured out that leaving fraudulent CEOs in charge of our largest banks was the key to financial stability.
Oh, my God. Yes, yes, and so this pretends that we're going to have another a crash. Is this why all these bankers are killing themselves globally? I mean, I know you don't know each specific case, but there's it's, what is it, 15, I don't know, 18 bankers. One of the most recent, a J.P. Morgan banker, was killed in a hit and run accident where a minivan ran into him and drove off and killed him. You know, he was with the bankruptcy division. He was a top bankruptcy attorney for J.P. Morgan.
As you say, we don't know. We know that one of the recent ones abroad had told people that he feared an investigation of his role in Deutsche Bank and such. And the reason that we're into these stupid rumors and such is the failure to do real investigations of the large entities in a real investigation, as I stress, and as was done in the savings and loan crisis, but was even done in the Enron era, until now we reach the point, and of course we haven't mentioned the obvious, and that is that big finance is the leading financial contributor to both parties. Nor have we mentioned the fairly obvious, that places like DealBook at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, period, with Murdoch and such, these are entities that like to have nice lunches with big bankers and such, and they're essentially more like a scandal, sheet, like for movie stars, in the way they operate, as opposed to serious journalists. The famous denunciation in the savings and loan crisis of a Washington Post reporter who had a Pulitzer Prize to be, won easily had she covered it, was that, yes, she was the one chasing mice while lions roamed the campsite. Well, that's what we have.
Lions roam the campsite, and these guys are chasing. Yes, I mean, the mainstream media is an embarrassment. I mean, I look at USA Today. I used to work for a Gannett company, or the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and I know there's a huge problem, and they don't. Really? Really? I know that, and they don't? Come on.
Yeah, there's still good people at both of these places.
But they don't do it, and I know people that they don't do it. They're afraid of getting fired. I mean, they let me go because why? I was exposing, hey, all the banks are in trouble. Hey, we don't have a recovery. Hey, that's a lie. What they're talking about, so, subprime's going to be contained. All the things I was saying on CNN. Oops, don't need you, Greg Hunter. But I'm glad they did me a big favor. I don't mean to get off into that. The best thing I ever did was USA Watchdog. I get to say what needs to be said and get to have people on like you. But I just want to fast forward to the last thing. This could, listen, just because they haven't prosecuted the crime, just because they've covered it over in the mainstream media, doesn't mean we won't have an even bigger blow-up. Do you think we're going to have another blow-up?
No.
And a
It
bigger
works
one?
the opposite way. If you don't have any accountability, you make certain that not only that there will be a next blow-up, but that it will be worse, right? We have done both things in the wrong direction. In other words, when you get massive fraud, it's going to be because you can make a lot of money, and with modern executive compensation, we have maximized that off the charts, and that you can do so with very little risk of prosecution. Well, we've just said, basically, we've de facto removed the criminal laws for a particular elite class of frauds. You put those two things together, you can make a ton of money as a sure thing, not as a risk, not as a gamble, not as expertise. Accounting fraud is a sure thing that under modern executive compensation is guaranteed to promptly make you as a CEO, a CFO, exceptionally wealthy. And you won't be prosecuted. And even if they bring a civil suit, Bank of America will pay it.
So
engage in fraud.
So the crash. So give me a handicap the crash that's coming. Tell me about the crash that's coming.
Well, the economy has to recover enough to get into large-scale bubbles again, and the recovery is modest. We're doing stupid austerity-type things and such that are slowing the recovery.
We're also doing Obamacare. That's slowing the recovery.
I actually don't think so much, but whatever one's views on the Affordable Care Act, the economy has to get humming again to have the really big bubbles. Now, we are subject to shocks before then. China lies about everything, right? As a matter of course, its statistics are not reliable, and it's obvious in looking at the buildup of things like office buildings and such with unused capacity that they have huge bubbles.
That could cause us to crash too.
It can. It won't be as big as if it's a homegrown massive disaster, because we're still much larger than the Chinese economy. But it could certainly derail our modest recovery and potentially put us even into recession. The Eurozone is, the equivalent of bleeding the patient still is its economics with its austerity programs. They've learned nothing from economics. And so their recovery is pitiful. People need to understand that Italy, Spain, and Greece, these nations are not in recessions. They are in levels of unemployment that exceed the Great Depression. And the hawks, the austerity hawks that are running things, are publicly predicting, I'm quoting Olli Rehn, are publicly predicting that it will take Spain 10 years to exit the crisis stage.
That's if we don't have another blow-up.
Well, that's right. That's assuming that there are no bad things in the interim, which is not a safe theory over a 10-year time horizon, of course. So, again, we destroyed, not us personally, but we as a society run by these folks in finance, destroyed the global financial system in Europe and the United States. And but for hyper-aggressive bailouts, we would have all been in Great Depressions. So the lesson that these folks have learned is, open the spigots. Don't stop the bankers.
William Black, thank you for your appraisal of what's going on and what continues to go on in the finance world. Thank you so much for joining us today, William Black at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you. Take care.